welcome again, and thank you very much.
It's pretty interesting community, Nimbin. I've been here about 30 years now, and like a lot of people, I was a regular cannabis user, and out there in the world, you get judged pretty harshly. Really, I don't think people are that hung up on using pot, but they're really hung up on the idea that we're a criminal. So almost a bit like, although it's an extreme example, it's a bit like a leper colony here in ways. Potheads have moved here to the north coast, and particularly around Nimbin, for 30 or 40 years now. So a big percentage of the population probably uses cannabis regularly, or everybody would know someone who does. So it's a sort of well-drug educated village. And there's been so many lies, to say it simply, lies spread about the plant cannabis, starting in the 1930s with the Reefer Madness campaign, that it'll turn you into a murderer and a rapist. It's pretty much the opposite. And just keep an open mind here today. Most of the people you'll see out there and up here are regular smokers of pot. We're used to it. It doesn't turn you into someone who sits around under a banana tree doing nothing all day. We're all busy and active and work. And I realise now that it's simply a medicinal herb. And I don't mind if they want to legalise extreme medical things at the start, but in the end, even kids, I think, coming home from school smoking cones are doing it to de-stress, are doing it to relax. So it's interesting. I mean, alcohol was traditionally the same way. It's a medicine. I think we've kind of turned it into a social drug just about now in Australia. Anyway, first up I want to really thank Dr. Andrew Katelaris, who's come up from Sydney again. Dr. Pot, as people are calling him now. He's a lively speaker and a big original thinker. And we've got lots of time for him here, and he's been supporting us in our efforts to legalise weed and spread the word on what the truth is on it for more than 20 years now. So, Andrew, please thank him for coming up from Sydney. And we'll have room for some questions. There's terrific hemp seed, local organic tucker out there. We'll have a decent break in a couple of hours. Then I've got a bunch of different patients and users of medical cannabis and their carers to tell their stories.
Now, unfortunately, it's becoming very, very clear that all the good, safe, effective drugs are being pushed into one black corner of prohibition, and far more dangerous drugs are being pushed on the population. Most people might be aware that there's an epidemic of Oxycontin-induced death in America, and now the death rate is running at somewhere between 50 and 100 people a day. It's pretty serious business. And like all things, if you remember the adage that Greenpeace gave you, where if you put a frog in hot water, if you throw it in a bucket of hot water, that frog will violently struggle to get out of the bucket. But if you put it into cold water and gently heat it, it won't appreciate that things are getting hot, and it will die without resistance. That's what's happening in this society. All the frogs are being slow boiled and they don't even realise they're being cooked. Okay, are we in control of our future? Because at the end of the day, the future is really all we've got. Right? The past is the past, and the present is rapidly moving into the future. So, are we in control? I'd have to say not. We're living in delusional times now. And I know there's a poem by Henry Lawson, I think. He says that so it must be while the world goes rolling round its course. So that the warning voice shall, the warning pen shall write in vain, the warning voice grow hoarse. That's the case. People are blowing the whistle. But what's happening? We're like in a rerun of political intrigue and manipulation by governments and agencies beyond the government that are actually inculcating a position of fear so that they can control and direct the population in the directions that they want them to go. There is no doubt we're now being driven in many different ways. It used to be the communists. It was then the Asian immigrants. Now it's the Muslims. You just pick your enemy, but one by one, they're used for the same process of demonisation. Thanks. Okay, for those students of history, does everyone in this room know what the Reichstag fire was?
Hitler.
Yeah, no, hang on, just see the hands again, because that's interesting. Oh, that's not too bad. The Reichstag fire was a manipulation of history by the Nazi Party, where they burnt down their own parliament called the Reichstag and then blamed a demented, blind Dutch communist as a representative of the Communist Party. This guy was so demented, when the police found him, he was trying to light a fire by unpicking the fibre of his shirt and get it going. But I think the police then helped the fire along with some cans of petrol, and he was blamed for the crime. On the basis of that, the Communist Party was legalised, the Nazis seized their votes and assumed total control. Okay, next one. That is not the only false flag event of history. False flag, when an item is blamed on someone else. Has everyone heard of the Gulf of Tonkin? I've got a more informed audience here than the general public. It runs at about 1% in the general public. A war in which 3 million people were directly killed and 5 million people were genetically maimed and a country laid to waste with dioxin contamination was begun after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the Americans claimed their destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. In fact, nothing of the sort happened. There was never an attack, and it was completely a false flag operation to justify the unleashing of one of the largest area bombardment in recorded history. Moving to the present time, how many people believe the official version of the World Trade Center? Okay, that's good. Looks like the sheep are outside. It is very sad. The problem with getting away with a lie is you're then encouraged to get away with a bigger lie. 9/11 was the biggest lie. And I think it was Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, said, if you're going to tell a lie, make it a big one, because you're more likely to get away with it. 9/11 was the biggest lie. The sad thing is, anyone with a functional IQ and a scintilla of physical science understanding can appreciate the official story not only isn't true, but can't possibly be true. 3 buildings, and I'll go on to the 3 buildings, fell at free fall speed. Now that means when the buildings collapsed, they fell just as quick as if you dropped a brick from the top of them. And a 110-storey building fell in 11 seconds. Building 7 that wasn't hit by an aeroplane fell in 7 seconds. Building 7, has everyone heard of Building 7? Yeah, Building 7 housed a huge FBI investigation of Halliburton and Enron, companies owned by Rumsfeld, and companies that probably took part in the manufacture of the specialist thermite explosives that were used to bring the buildings down. I won't dwell on this, but suffice it to say, we live in a land now of false flags, and they're going to escalate. The recent drama in Paris is undoubtedly a false flag operation designed to propel Europe towards a state of fear-filled militancy and police state. Okay. What about this one, Fukushima? Now, you can't really call it a false flag, but it's something we have to discuss. Most of this talk is about medical cannabis, but you can't look at medical cannabis in the context of a world that's seriously out of balance. You've got to look at all the issues, because medical cannabis is only so good for returning health to people. You've got to work on a lot of different sides of the equation. I'll just give you a 2-minute rundown on Fukushima, I should call it. Fukushima is a proper Japanese pronunciation. That site was examined by General Electric in 1958. In 1958, they took the contract to build a power plant there. Interestingly, it had a 30-metre cliff, but General Electric engineers cut the cliff down to 10 metres to make it easier to get their construction gear on. Now, this was on a site prone to tsunamis on a known fault line, and then they installed 6 antiquated, militarily designed reactors designed for submarines there, right in an earthquake zone. And just to finish it off, they put the emergency diesel generators in the basement. Right, now, you can't make this stuff up. These facts are there, but no heads are rolling. So a 30-metre cliff was reduced, and emergency electricity was put in the basement. You can't call this a nuclear accident. There is some dark force directing this sort of stupidity or some malignant human intention to actually wreak damage in the world. Fukushima is undoubtedly the greatest nuclear disaster that's ever befallen this planet. I can say that without a scintilla of contradiction or risk of contradiction. I can go further in saying it is worse than every other nuclear disaster we've had combined and multiplied. It makes Chernobyl look like a pimple. Basically, Chernobyl was a chemical explosion in a nuclear facility. There was a one-off release of cesium and other nucleotides in a physical explosion. What we've got at Fukushima is a triple meltdown. Triple meltdown, 3 meltdowns are going on. That means the reactor is outside of its metal container. It's burnt through 6 foot of concrete and now it's in the dirt. Right? We've got a nuclear fire with no real prospects of putting it out. So what do? They put a news media blackout over it. No one talks about it. In Japan, it's evidently hard to get Geiger counters now, and you're not allowed to write articles about it for fear of panicking the population. And meantime, they're pumping 300 tonnes of seawater onto it each day to stop it going critical and just letting that water run out to sea. Where does it go when you run it out to sea? You remember the little adage, the solution to pollution is not dilution, right? In a few months only, the plume was detectable on the west coast of America, where the Americans promptly doubled the safety exposure limit and stopped doing routine testing, as they stopped doing routine testing of the seafood, although they claimed to have done one survey and found everything was under control. And I believe that along with the tooth fairy. But Fukushima is actually a problem currently, in my mind, insoluble. And it's only really a question of trying to minimise the damage. If we're to plan a response to it, what we have to do is convene all nuclear interested nations in an urgent conference and actually let people with nuclear physics experience try and work on this problem. But the idea of pulling a blanket over it and just pretending it's not happening is really a mark of irresponsibility at the most extreme level. Okay, here, now coming back to the herd, it's been subject to the same sort of false flag operations. Now firstly, look at the sort of, when I first saw this as a teenager, I think some of the older boys showed me, I thought this is something I could get interested in. I mean, the idea of sharing drugs with semi-dressed women wasn't such a terrible thing at that stage. But you look at this, cannabis is hardly ever associated with being injected or anything like that, weird parties, wild orgies, these sorts of things. It's a grotesque parody of the true situation. Now, as it's turning out, we have probably one of the most benign healing medicines on the planet, but a government that's still controlling 50% of the armaments in this world can get away with that sort of crap 80 years ago and still dish it up now is really a measure of how disempowered we have become. Has everyone seen this? This was an article printed in Popular Mechanics magazine back in 1937, 1938, when the American government was trying to enact the marijuana transfer tax law. Popular Mechanics is not an extreme magazine. It's a middle-of-the-road, mums and dads magazine, but they argue correctly that there was no place for illegalising this crop, that it could be used to make 25,000 items of commerce and, a bright and rosy future. But its sane voice was lost in the babble of the Randolph-Hearst press, and the rest, as they say, is history. Okay, you all know about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle in its simplest form is pretty straightforward. All the animals, including us, take in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. The plants are the obverse of that. They take in the carbon dioxide and release oxygen. For the planet to function well, you need a balance of the two. What have we done over the last sort of 2,000 years for our wars with our axes? We've chopped down the trees, burnt the trees, dug up the coal, and basically created a huge imbalance. Master your technology, mate. A huge imbalance. The biggest issue at the moment, as I understand it, is not even the global warming, although that's bad enough, but the acidification of the oceans and the loss of the phytoplankton and the collapse of marine ecosystem entirely, which is probably a process which is already underway. All right, what are we trying to do? Medical cannabis is only I won't say a small part, but a minor part of the whole hemp revolution. If we don't, and if we're unsuccessful in obtaining a revolution, and I use the word advisedly, a revolution in our thinking that leads to a revolution in our behaviour such that we rapidly transit from a hydrocarbon-based economy, we're sitting on plastic chairs, I hope not too many of you are wearing plastic clothes, eating food out of plastic containers, all made from hydrocarbons, much of it from the Middle East and much of it won on war and bloodshed. Unless we transit that to a carbohydrate-based economy, we won't have a future worthy of talking. By a future, I mean that the level of functioning, the intellectual and humanist achievements of each generation should be above the one before. It should be that each generation stands on the shoulders of the other and achieves greater height. That's not what's happening. The greed and selfishness of this current generation and their political ideologues are trampling on the future of the future, as it were, and with disastrous consequences. That's not my vision of the future, but that's Monsanto's vision. Next one. Plastics. That's not a very good photo, but it's not a very good subject either. That's a beach, literally wall to wall with plastic. Now, we've spoken at other talks about the Central Pacific Gyre. That's a 300 million tonne plastic garbage dump of decaying plastic centred around the centre of the Pacific. Its average height is about 3 metres thick, and it subsists about a metre below sea level. It's starting to strand, and the fish are starting to eat it. And this is going to be a mighty contribution to the destruction of that ecosystem. There could be plans for salvaging some of this, but in this country, we haven't even made the momentous decision to ban plastic bags in supermarkets. Right? How far behind are we? The packaging industry has managed to stymie a 5 cent or 10 cent deposit on the bottles, which would guarantee no litter at all. You just have to go to places where they get 10 cents a bottle. There's no litter on the ground. There are sensible ways to fix these problems. Okay, now here's the medical component. That's enough to put you in a happy mood about where we're going in the future. What are we going to do about it? Staying healthy in an unhealthy world is a challenge, and equipping your children with the tools to walk through this chemical minefield that's been laid out before us is a very important thing to be doing. A small test was done by the American Red Cross some years ago. They examined the umbilical cord blood of 200 infants, half of them in the country, half of them in the cities. Every child's umbilical cord blood contained DDT. This is even despite the fact that it was banned 20 years ago. Every cord blood contained dieldrin. The average number of chemicals was over 150 in each child. Teflon, all the xenoestrogens from the plastics were all represented at birth now. That's why we're facing the real prospect of this generation being one that will live less long, not as long, and in less good health as their parents' generation. We're used to an incrementally increasing public health. It looks like the easy days are over, and now the pigeons are going to come home to roost, and we'll have to face the serious consequences of our, I won't say our irresponsible behaviour, because we didn't do it, but our lack of resistance to that irresponsible behaviour, and sometimes that's just as bad. Thanks, Sista. Oh no, sorry, go back, I missed the rest of it. Could I just go back? Yeah. Okay, increasing electromagnetic smog. That's getting a lot of airtime around Europe at the moment, and some of the French schools have even banned Wi-Fi and said cable their computers into the. It's a very sensible precaution. Now, the issue of what does and doesn't cause cancer has to be addressed. Everyone says, "Oh, cigarette smoking causes cancer. This causes cancer. That does." You can't really look at it in a fairly simplistic way. Say, for instance, you ingest a gram of plutonium. I mean, you will get cancer if it doesn't kill you from acute radiation first, because of just its absolute potency. But most of the cancer risks work in concert together. So say, for instance, you're exposed to large doses of electromagnetic smog and chemical contamination. They work together, and the cancer will manifest at an area of your genetic weakness. Do you want to ask a question?
I'd like to say that Mum Nimbin Steiner School, Shearwater has removed Wi-Fi and has catered the whole school.
Just speak up.
Mum Nimbin Steiner School has removed Wi-Fi from the school and they've cabled the school, so it's happening here too.
Well, one swallow doesn't make a spring. It's a very welcome start, and I mean that's the only reason why these communities are so important, because it's from the nucleus of resistance and intelligence that the ripples spread out. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that, but we've still got about 200,000 other institutions to follow suit. Okay, in terms of cancer causation, so you have to look at it as a balance between provoking factors like electromagnetic smog, chemical contamination, the fluoride, a whole host of things that reduce your resistance, versus a lifestyle that will encourage your resistance. And I'm increasingly finding, because we've been dealing with intractable cancers now, all the doctors' failures are coming to us now, increasingly finding, just like Fukushima, there is no easy solution to this current cancer epidemic. And I use the fact that there's a cancer epidemic quite advisedly. The incidence of cancer is rising alarmingly. But when you question serious professional doctors like Professor Patterson or PA and things like that, oh, I don't think so, and it just seems the same to me, they don't have data. And even when it's staring them in the face, and the epidemiologists tell us that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2 people will have a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime, that doesn't seem to shake them out of their complacency. Fluoride. I mean, I'll be singing this anti-fluoride song until it's out of the water. Are you all pretty up to date on fluoride? I'll just give you the 10-second presentation. Fluoride is bad enough. It entered life in a big scale in the public health arena during the Second World War in America, where Alcoa, the aluminium smelting company that was making aluminium for airplanes, emitted a lot of fluoride, and they found that it killed everything in a huge swathe downwind of the place. So then they had to start scrubbing it out of their chimneys, and they found they couldn't store it in metal containers because the fluorosilicic acid was too corrosive. So some genius got the idea of throwing it into the water and invented the whole fluoride thing. Now let me say, topical fluoride applied or even ingested between the ages of 8 and 14 has a modest effect on reducing dental caries. Okay? That's as far as it goes. Let me say that you can get the same effect with just good dental hygiene. Most countries in Europe stopped fluoride decades ago on health concerns. And I think it was up here in a previous talk I showed some data from North and South Ireland, which is quite available on the internet, and it behoves you all to look at it very carefully. Dr. Declan, I think it was, D-E-K-L-A-N, he looked at North fluoridated Ireland and South unfluoridated Ireland. There are dramatic differences in cancer incidence. In fact, when you plot the highest occurring ratios and the lowest, it's almost a dichotomy. It separates out very clearly. But that's hasn't gone any further than that. Our fluoride, well, not our fluoride, the fluoride that they're poisoning our water supply with, I should say, is a mixture from Burrell, from their rock phosphate, but most of it comes from the Shanghai Rock Phosphate Company. Do you all know this? Shanghai Rock Phosphate Company supplies the fluorosilicates that are added to Australian drinking water. It's co-contaminated with lead, cadmium and arsenic. But the government doesn't want to measure for the arsenic and cadmium, so they just do an indicative level of lead, and as long as it's under 1 part per million, they allow it in. Right? 1 part per million doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot when you're talking about water, because this is a one-way in, no way out sort of thing. So in your lifetime, you're just filled up with these heavy metals, with the consequence that you end up with accelerated intellectual decay, dementia, osteoporosis, and a very significantly increased cancer risk. Okay, iodine. Iodine's a fascinating mineral. It is essential for life. If you don't get iodine, in some places where, say for instance the Andes Mountains or the Himalayas, where there's an endemic deficiency of iodine because the high mountains over the centuries, over the millennia, all the iodine's washed down to the sea. That's why the iodine is in seafood and not in the mountains. These people have endemic goiters or huge swellings of their thyroid, where the thyroid tries to make up for the fact there's no iodine. But if that starts in childhood, you end up as a medical cretin. Right, now the word cretin is abused as a term of abuse, but in fact it means the profound intellectual impairment induced by a lack of iodine. So iodine is a critically essential mineral. Now in times past, certainly it was added to the table salt, But the main input for the population was actually that they added it to bread as a leavening agent, not as an intentional effort to make the people happier or healthier, but to make the bread leaven better, evidently. But some clever bastard about 20 years ago discovered you could put bromide in instead, and it was a lot cheaper, and it worked just as well physically. But the unintended consequence, or the intended consequence, depending on how you view it, was that there was a deficiency of iodine which was exacerbated by the bromide. Because iodine is in the same chemical class as fluoride, bromine and chlorine, all of which are mounting up against it. So they're blocking it. They're blocking its absorption and its effect. So it's very hard. The current recommendation for iodine is 150 micrograms. That's 0.15 of a milligram, just over a tenth of a milligram per day. In countries that have an adequate supply of iodine, and that's up around 8 milligrams, so, you know, like dozens of times higher, they have less infant mortality, greater longevity, and lower incidence of breast fibrocystic disease and other disorders. So there's clearly a public health issue around iodine. When I started studying this up a couple of years ago, I went on the internet to buy some iodine for my family and found that all that was on offer was a gross and blatant rip-off. You were getting microgram doses at milligram prices, and it was just an unviable way to supplement, given that we don't only need the amount to nourish the body, but you have to get over the blockade induced by the fluoride, the chlorine and the bromide. Just to add a bit of salt to the wounds, the government then dictated we have to saturate all our soft furnishings and a lot of our clothes with bromide as a fire retardant. So we're really getting it from all angles. With that regard, what I've decided to do is take it into my own hands, and we're now supplying iodine. So after this talk, I'll be out the back with little jars of iodine which you can procure for a number of reasons. Firstly, to assure your intake and that of your children especially, so that their intellectual development proceeds to a level where they can. You can block the effects of fluoride if you can't get access to properly filtered water, and bear in mind just about everything is coated with this stuff anyway. Anyway, more to be said about that later. The xenoestrogens in the plastics. We really have to address the issue of plastics. We're being choked by a silent epidemic of delayed action poisons, and that's the problem with the plastics. They kill slowly. They might kill a turtle quickly by strangulation, but for us and the species, they kill by going right through the food chain, impairing its fertility, increasing mutagenesis, and basically degrading the life forms. Okay. Now, what I'm trying to do here is give you an understanding of the current concepts of what disease is, so you can better address it. Right? Forewarned is forearmed. Inflammation is underlying most of the human diseases that we're now contending with. Even the allopaths are now accepting that and starting in very grudging and small steps to address the issue of inflammation. It started with asthma. Asthma used to be said it was an allergic disease, but then they appreciated inflammation was the principal cause. Ironically, things like cardiovascular disease are also related to inflammation. So we have to actually look at the mechanisms of which the diseases are caused, even if we can't interrupt what's coming at us. We can't interrupt the electromagnetic smog that's bathing us. It's very hard to avoid the plastic contamination. So you then have to take steps within your own body to minimise its risks. Luckily, most of the things, including radiation, that impact on our bodies and cause cancers and other sorts of diseases, do so through the medium of oxygen-free radicals. This is just a fancy name for a chemical radical that destroys things because it's unbalanced in terms of its electron number. So if you have an oxygen radical that's missing an electron, it'll go scavenging, they call them, scavenging electrons from anything that's handy. If that happens to be one of your DNA molecules, off it'll go, and that oxygen-free radical doesn't care if your DNA then miscopies, because it's got its electron and that's all it wants. It's about as selfish as most of the members of our government. Okay, free radical scavengers. Basically, you've got your own intrinsic system of free radical scavenging. You might have heard of the glutathione system. Glutathione Glutathione is an enzyme which is one of the main detoxifying enzymes in the body, but it's nowhere, it's enough. If you're living in a pristine rainforest, eating organically grown, rain-fed food, your glutathione's probably enough. But in today's world, where we're daily subject to a whole range of severe biochemical insults, we need to optimise both the functioning of your internal systems, and they will only work if your biochemistry works properly. Did I tell you the Brazil nut story? I think I'll just digress for a minute to tell you this. Selenium is an essential mineral for the production of glutathione. In New Zealand last year they did a little trial where they put 100 people on selenium tablets and 100 people on 2 Brazil nuts a day, because the Brazil nuts concentrate selenium. At the end of a 3-month trial, they found that the group who took the tablets and the group who had the Brazil nuts had very similar blood levels of selenium. And the original conclusion was it didn't make any difference if you got it from natural or artificial sources. But when they measured the glutathione activity in the people's blood, they found that the Brazil nut group was 3 times higher. Not a little bit, 3 times higher. And the resolution of that is that it's the essential cofactors in the complex foods that make them more effective. Nutrition is not a simple matter, and it can't be done by slogans or simple supplements. It has to be done by a concerted effort to bring everything to the table in the right balance at the right time. Vitamin C, we can talk for a day on that. We're certainly moving more and more towards intravenous vitamin C in emergency situations, but that will probably be reported on next year. Okay. Daily I sit across the desk from people with cancer diagnosis, and we talk about their diet, say, oh, but I have a good diet, doc. And, you know, under my breath, I said, that's why you're sitting here with a cancer diagnosis. I mean, that might be a bit unfair, but it is true to a point. There's basically 3 classes of diet. Now, this I don't mean paleo or vegetarian or vegan or anything like that. 3 classes of diet that I interpret. The first one is a standard American diet, or the SAD diet. That's centred around McDonald's and all the other sort of trans fats, esterified sort of nightmares that they're currently calling food. Each of those meals, when you digest a meal, when you ingest and digest a meal, it is inevitable that you create oxygen-free radicals. It's just part of metabolism. The analogy is if you have a campfire to warm you up, you can't avoid having sparks come off the campfire. So the sparks are the oxygen-free radicals. If you quench the sparks, you don't start a bushfire. If you let the sparks take root, you'll start a bushfire. With the SAD diet, every meal, you end up with more oxygen-free radicals and you have a rapid decline. What they commonly review as a good diet, you know, the good diet that all these patients are on, it may be good enough for a well person, or it may be good enough for someone living in a pristine environment, because each meal is neutral with regard to metabolically generated free radicals. That means it doesn't make you worse, but nor is there a surplus of radical scavengers, free radical scavengers left over to make you contend with what's out there. So when you leave the table, it's not good enough that the meal didn't make you worse. It has to supply a surplus of free radical scavenging capacity to equip you to suck up the damage that's coming from the outside and not let it impact on your body. You really do have to aim for a superior diet, and a superior diet has to be intelligently selected to suit the metabolism and lifestyle of the person, but with the centrality being each mouthful has to advance the cause of your wellness, not drag you back. Right? Food is not about indulgence, it's about fueling the body to do useful work in a life, which is all too short when you look back at it, so it's not there to be wasted. Okay, next one. You are what you eat. Now, that's not an original statement, and I find it really hard to come up with original statements, nor do I feel I have to. I prefer to recycle the good oldies. You are what you eat. How can anyone dispute that? What else can we be? Right? I have had distressing times at the Children's Hospital at Bear Cottage, which is the hospice centre of the Children's Hospital at Manly, where we're trying to salvage children with brain cancers, and we have to fight against medical doctors and professors telling the patients' parents that it doesn't matter what they feed their kids, it won't make any difference, they can have donuts or whatever they want. And this is a particularly distressing sellout by the profession, at a crisis time in people's lives. The problem with making dietary choices, it's not what you have today or tomorrow, it's what you've had for the last 7 years or more. Right? The body just can't be metabolically altered overnight. A critical long-term choice has to be in the fats that you choose. If you habitually take the wrong fats into your body, they will be incorporated into your cells and then your system will not function. We spoke at some length at another talk about the endocannabinoid system, and I hope a lot of you have read up about that. I'll touch on it a bit more. But the balance firstly between omega-3 and omega-6, which have to be present in the right ratio of 1 to 3, and the avoidance of the trans fats are critical. Because once they're in your membranes, the turnover, especially neuronal membrane, is very slow, it's years. So, you may take several years to actually correct the habitual poor choices of the previous 7 years. And if you're then battling with an acute disease, it becomes very difficult to fix the metabolism quick enough to save you from the disease. Okay, next one please, Sister. Cholesterol theory. There's a lot of words written about cholesterol, but the truth has been buried under the manufactured hysteria. The way I interpret the situation with cholesterol was back in the 50s or the 60s, chemists working for pharmaceutical companies invented a class of drugs, or created a class of drugs called the statins. Now there's dozens of them, but they're all in the same class. And what they do is selectively poison the liver and its enzymes that make cholesterol. Now cholesterol is so important to our physiology that if you don't have enough in your diet, your body has to manufacture the cholesterol. Okay, so that's really a mark of how essential it is. And these clever bastards have worked out a way of poisoning the liver and artificially forcing your cholesterol low. Then, to justify getting this drug onto the market and claiming the $12 or $14 billion a year in sales that they get each year, they had to create a theory. So they came up with the cholesterol theory of disease. Now this is simplicity in itself. It says simply the higher your level of cholesterol in your blood, the more likely you are to have a heart attack or a coronary event or a stroke or any other vascular catastrophe. With the theory, by a mechanism which wasn't understood by them or anyone, this cholesterol got into the artery walls and made atheroma. That's the cholesterol theory. There's a few really serious flaws with the cholesterol theory, and that's these basically. Most people who have vascular events have them at the normal levels, what they call the normal levels of cholesterol. So high cholesterol may be a risk factor, but it's certainly not a causation. The next thing is, and I've investigated these because I spent a lot of time behind the microscope during my research times, is that there is indeed cholesterol in coronary artery atheroma. You can see the cholesterol. But the critical thing is it's oxidised or rancid cholesterol. When you look at it, it's very clear. They call them cholesterol cliffs. They're rancid cholesterol, and it's the rancid cholesterol that provokes the inflammatory cells or the macrophages to react, release the cytokines which then cause the atheroma. So the critical difference between the modified cholesterol theory of disease and the standard cholesterol theory is that the level of cholesterol is not critical, it's the level of oxidation. So for instance, if you have a way high level of cholesterol, as long as it's not too high, but none of it's rancid because you're living out in the rainforest eating mangoes or something like that, you're not going to have a cardiac event. But if you have a cholesterol of only 4 and 3/4 of it is rancid because you're on the SAD diet, you will have a vascular event at a young age. I mean, these things are established fairly clearly and it's not really controversial. It's just amazing that the truth can't get out and it's actually drowned by the hysteria of commercially driven things. Just to come back to the iodine that I mentioned, thyroxine, which is triiodothyroxine, it's the hormone produced by your thyroid gland, is the largest selling drug in the Western world. Now, they net something like $4 billion a year just from it. But they're doing it simply because most people are hypothyroid because of lack of iodine. It's a bit like giving people blood transfusions for iron deficiency rather than giving them iron. But that's what they're doing because it's much more profitable and it gives them control. And it also makes for a population of slightly apathetic, slightly dim-witted, unenergetic people, which are much easier to control. Okay, now that was just a little aside. To come back to the cholesterol theory, the oxidised cholesterol is what's the trouble, so you should treat your risk factors mostly as removing of the oxidative stress and keeping all the fats and lipids in unoxidised forms. Beyond that, the statins have a range of serious side effects. They poison the liver, they cause greatly increased risk of diabetes, cognitive decline and dementia, and in sensitive people, very severe myopathy and weakness. So, 3 good reasons to avoid them.
Can I add to the bastard bit? They did a study in 2001, you're laughing, it's not funny, Texas Air Force people, and, the cholesterol,
Oh, there's a long-term safety study on cholesterol-lowering drugs conducted on the Texas Air Force, and they basically found there was an increased risk of death when given to healthy people. They hid the data about the terminal cancer deaths for 3 years, convened the National Cholesterol Education Panel, lowered the rate at which you and I had to initiate cholesterol-lowering therapy, increasing the risk of mortality, increasing the risk of rhabdomyolysis, complete muscle cell breakdown and death. And then they published the data in a smaller journal of American cardiologists, so nobody actually found out in the medical profession that they're actually killing people. And since then they tripled their income from $12 billion per annum, $34 billion per annum increase in sales to $48 billion for crippling people and giving them cancer.
Listen, I'll just say in response to that, direct response, about 15 years ago, I think it was, this woman gave me a box of photocopies on this subject, which probably completely changed the direction of what I've been doing with my life. Right, the inflammatory mediators and all the rest of it, so yeah, good point. Okay, next one. Okay, the lipid bilayer, this is coming back to the cholesterol thing, and this is what I'm basically talking about. I'll be talking about cancer fairly shortly, but you've got to get it clear, right? Cannabis is not a panacea for cancer, especially cancer that's advanced, metastatic and previously treated. Right? We can still get exceptional cures, but most of that is beyond the pale. The only way forward is prevention. And it might seem ridiculous if you have to think about your 5-year-old in terms of cancer prevention, but that's what you have to do. In my practice, in my experience over the last 30 years, I've seen the age of the cancer incidence is dropping alarmingly. I've said this before, in cancers like pancreatic cancer, it used to be an older man's disease, are young women getting it now? There is a frightening deterioration because the general resistance is lower, the degradation of the food supply is much more profound, and that's the result. Now, a cell is made up of this lipid bilayer. There's phospholipids. The phosphorus, or the red little knobs at the end, are water soluble, and the lipids, or the little sticks on the inside, are hydrophobic, or they don't like water. So when you mix them together, the hydrophobic ones that don't like water join up, and the ones that do like water, and that's how we have cell membranes. And through these cell membranes are the receptors, including the CD1 and the CD2 receptors, which form one half of the endocannabinoid system. The other half of the endocannabinoid system are on the next cell, because remember, the endocannabinoid system is a system where the cells communicate with each other, but it does so in a unique way. Most of our cells communicate through chemical messages like adrenaline or thyroxine or any of the sex hormones. But with the endocannabinoid system, the communication is from one cell to another. And the unique thing about it is that the cell that feeds back on its sister cell or its brother cell to calm the farm, to relax or to stimulate or whatever the right message is, operates by a mechanism for which we don't know. Basically, the anandamide, or the actual endogenous cannabinoid, manifests out of this cell membrane, and as the textbooks say, on demand, without any idea of what signal is driving it. But it is clear to me from that first thing, you are what you eat. If you haven't got a cell membrane with the right lipid constituents, which are derived over a long time, and not over the last week or month, but over the last few years, you're unable to manufacture these lipid products, because that's what anandamide is, it's a lipid product. Therefore, you'll have a total endocannabinoid deficiency. So the wellness has to start with getting your fats and lipids right. Next one, please. Okay, we've covered, I think, most of that. That's just a diagram of the endocannabinoid system as it works to moderate the activity of other cells. So if a nerve transmits a message down from up to down, the endocannabinoid system feeds back to regulate the intensity of that signal and when it stops and starts. So it's critically important. Okay. Okay, cancer. I mean, a lot of people have a lot of personal interest embedded in this subject, and for good reason. It's cutting a swathe through the population, young and old. It's certainly, and I'll say it 100 times, it's better prevented than treated. It is a lot easier to prevent cancer than to treat it. That the incidence is increasing rapidly is undeniable, despite the fact that the profession is currently denying it, and despite the fact we don't have proper data. How hard would it be with the internet to have accurate cancer treatments? I mean, everyone with a cancer diagnosis should have all the interventions that are put on them by any professional collated, so we can look at what people are getting and what their outcomes are. At this stage, it's all done in a fragmented way, so someone will do a little trial, but he doesn't know what the other people are doing. And no one really knows where we're going. At other talks, I talked about the Holstead mastectomy. A loudmouth American insisted that to cure breast cancer, you had to do a disfiguring operation which removed the pectoral muscles and all the lymph nodes. Horrendous side effects. 50 years later, it was found it made no difference and probably made it worse. They are not operating on scientific basis. The scientific basis makes observations, frames hypotheses, and does experiments. Right? That's what the scientific method is. I am a scientist. You're a scientist. People who are honest are scientists. People who use science as a rationalisation rather than a methodology aren't scientists. They're yes men for a corporate world. And that's our true enemy at the moment. The cancers are actually getting much more aggressive. It used to be, and in fact part of this is treatment related unfortunately, it used to be, say you had a bowel cancer, yeah, surgeons would get in there, they'd do the colectomy, might take out a few nodes, they might do this and that, and you generally, if they got it not too late, you'd have several years before there was much problem. If you modified your lifestyle, you might go on to wellness. But now, there's this shocking methodology where if you get a cancer diagnosis, instead of the surgeons having the first go at it, they're now sending you to the oncologist and the radiotherapist to get treated first to shrink the cancer and make it easier to get out. That's the rationale. But what actually happens? It's now well established and published that if you irradiate a cancer, you generate resistant cancer stem cells. Right? Let that sink in for a bit. Now there's times even I have to send patients for radiation. Right? If someone turns up with a cervical neck lesion in the bone eating away at their spinal cord, no amount of hemp seed smoothies is going to turn that around in the time that's required for them to maintain their lives. And we have to buy time, but we do so knowing that we're now in a defensive formation. So, as a rule, to use X-ray therapy before even an attempt at primary excision, in my mind, is actually reprehensible. But it's getting to the stage now where that surgical option is even being denied people until they've had this sort of therapy. And now we're seeing people turning up like 3 to 6 months later with widespread metastases and essentially untreatable disease. I don't think I'm being hysterical about this. Okay, chemotherapy. Now, most of you should know that chemotherapy had its origins in the First World War, and it wasn't by a group of dedicated doctors trying to cure disease. It was by a bunch of combatants throwing mustard gas at each other, and the British doctors noticed that their boys, after they'd had a lung full of mustard gas, their bone marrow was completely wiped out. So they said, oh, we'll try this on leukemia. And that's the way it actually started. It certainly shouldn't have been allowed to go as far as it has now. With chemotherapy, a lot of the oncologists that the patients go to and report back to me, they'll say something very much like this. Oh, the patient will ask, well, what's my prognosis, doctor? And he'll say, oh, if you have treatment, we can give you 12 months, but without treatment, you've got 3 months to live. My question is that, go and ask that little prick, where did he get that data from? How many people have not had treatment for their cancer to base those prognoses on? We're following several patients years down the track, sometimes 10 and 15 years down, with cancer present, but without it actually spreading or impacting on their lives. The plain fact is they have nothing to base that on because no one's doing any controlled arms of that trial. Further, and certainly in gastrointestinal cancer. Now, I don't want to put off chemo totally, because in certain emergencies, it's the only way to actually survive long enough to go on. But there, we're in a defensive action again. But in gastrointestinal malignancy, chemotherapy pretty clearly now actually shortens your prognosis over no treatment at all. Right? So let alone the optimistic and rosy prognostications I've given in the past, it is actually getting clearer and clearer that it actually makes things worse, and you're much better off doing nothing. You're much better off doing a lifestyle thing, but that's another argument altogether. The secondary cancers, we're seeing plenty of secondary cancers now. It used to be, it was about a 10-year latency between the radiation and the second cancers. Now they seem to be a bit shorter, and I think it reflects that whole imbalance that I was talking about before, of lack of protection from your diet and excess irritants from the environment. Hey, Sista. Can we do better? Of course we can do better. I mean, if we can't do better than this, there's not much for us to do. Accurate and accessible cancer data needs to be given, and universal cancer data. It is not hard to build a cancer registry. We have one, but it's meaningless because it's not collated across all the different practitioners. It's voluntary, and the whole thing, we're operating largely in the dark by not being fully aware of just how severe the problem is. The other important thing is access to raw research data prior to editing out of conflicting stuff. Now, if the people who want to pursue this, there's a thing called Pharmageddon, a book by Pharmageddon, which goes through this in exhaustive detail. But the common trick from the researchers is to, say, take 100 people that they're testing on their drug, say 10 of them die, we'll just write them out of the study, 10 of them drop out because they didn't like the side effects, drop them out of the study, and it goes on and on like this, and then they publish the results on 40 people. Boy, 90% response rate. That's the way it works. They never release the raw data. And when people have actually had to go to court to get raw data, it sometimes tells a very different story than what you'd actually want. Okay, what about active investigation of dietary therapies? I've got these idiots at the Children's Hospital, and I say that advisedly, idiots that tell the parents it doesn't matter what their children eat as to their wellness. It just shows how far we've got to go. And access to experimental cannabis therapy should only be limited by the patient's choice of whether they want it or not. Not by some little prick in the bed government or some little weasel in Turnbull's government deciding if your condition is eligible. The only criteria for experimental cannabis use should be the patient's choice, and that should be based on information. I can dig on that. Yeah. Can we do better still? At some stage, you actually have to get political. Right? You can express your politics in one way or another, but you do have to get political. The Hemp Party is making an effort to get started. It's a win-win. Right? We can't talk about health without talking about politics. How we make our paper, how we make our cars, what we fuel them on, all these things are critically important. The beauty of the cannabis movement is that it's a very, very broad church. It can affect people at every layer of their lives, from their capacity to find meaningful employment and career solutions for themselves and their children, rather than becoming factory slaves, turning out meaningless and poisonous products. It can revolutionise your health. It can revolutionise your personal and your creative capacities if it's used responsibly. Get behind the Hemp Party. Okay, next one. If you can't imagine a better future, you'll never have one. Think about that. Spend time imagining where you'd like things to be. I feel it has its own value as well. Psychic energy, remember, it's thought, word and deed. You think it first, you imagine it, you talk it, and then you do it. But you have to have all those three. You really do need to exercise your imagination. That's what puts us above other forms of life. We can imagine, we can plan, and we can move forward, I like to think. But we better start exercising that facility because it's quietly resting at the moment. Okay, that's my website. I'm raising money now for a grow room. We've already hung 8 lights there. I want to get to 20 fairly quickly. I am sick of waiting for governments to do trials. We've conducted the world's second largest test in intractable epilepsy, and that was funded on a shoestring. I want you to get get that GoFundMe campaign, pass it on to your connections. I want to see some serious money, buy some serious lights and increase our number of patients by tenfold over the next 12 months and then seek publication of the results. Because our concern is that the GW trials that are going to be done will be exercised by doctors with no commitment to showing the medicine in the best possible light. They will probably underdose and not carefully titrate the doses to the individual needs and obtain results that are less spectacular than the results that we're getting with simply prepared herbal cannabis. I made an attempt to actually have herbal cannabis included in the trial, but I was sent a book the size of a small telephone book to fill in, and I can't see myself sort of pursuing that, nor can I see the TGA approving it. On the subject of the TGA, there's been what I consider a serious backward step in the last little while. Richard Di Natale's bill to have an independent office of medical cannabis has been shelved by Turnbull's government. Turnbull now favours a TGA model of cannabis with the product only dispensed by doctors. This is a recipe for going slow and going nowhere. GW Pharmaceuticals is simply incapable of making any sort of meaningless impact on the world supply of cannabis. I think they grew something like 10 tonnes, where 10,000 tonnes or more is required. So it's meaningless to talk about this as a way forward. And when I read in your local Echo that nauseating half-wit bed claiming this has positioned Australia as a leader in medical cannabis research, it really fills me with disgust. All right, what else can I say? Will we do some questions or do some questions?
If we can quickly talk about the microphone.
Is it bad to smoke it?
Hey?
Is
Is it bad to smoke it?
it banned to smoke it?
Bad, is it bad?
Listen, we have to mature beyond good and bad duplicities, right? There's so many other issues. There was a big deal made about smoking, right? I mean, remember, and I think at previous talks I've shown as late as the 1950s, the medical profession was using itself as an advertising for tobacco smoking. Do you remember seeing those pictures of the doctor on a camel after he was even sitting in his bloody office with the little head thing on, oh, this is what I need for my throat. Okay, listen, the devil is in the dose always. I'm comfortable with smoking pot, but I don't smoke very much. I smoke small amounts more often. The quality of the pot is critical. What else you do is critical. The tobacco you mix it or don't mix it with are critical. These are the critical things. I mean, the standard advice is vaping's better. If you're having one or two puffs, I think it makes no difference, right? But it's a question of your overall, we don't go into good, bad. It's what suits your lifestyle, it's what you've got and things like that. Excess smoking with commercial tobacco out of a filthy bong can't be considered a health-giving habit.
Doctor, interested in your iodine availability. You can't get blue golds anywhere up the coast now because it's not available online. Presumably the Americans that are using it for anti-radiation.
Yeah, good question.
Is using either tincture applied to your wrist, say, a good...
Okay, the question is about what form of iodine.
Yeah.
Listen, I don't want to sound too conspiratorial, but the forces that be appear to be tightening their grip on common sense health producers. For instance, IV vitamin C is now getting very hard to get your hands on, even though it's not illegal. Right? Remember some years ago, 30 years ago, they banned comfrey. You remember that one?
Yeah.
Bloody comfrey. They claimed, I'll just give a little story about that, just to divert, and I'll come back to your iodine, but this is the way the system's operating. At that stage, I was a junior registrar at the Institute of Forensic Medicine, and someone from the UTS contacted me and said, oh, they're banning comfrey, Andrew, would you come onto our radio station and talk about it? And it was the UTS, it had a footprint of about 3 kilometres, so we're not dealing with, world news of the world or the BBC or something like that, the UTS footprint of about 3 kilometres. And I said my little piece, I said, look, comfrey has been a nutritious food and a very valuable agricultural crop for centuries. The Russians eat it as spinach and the only vegetable source of vitamin B12 and on it went. And they said, what about the pyrazolidine alkaloids that they're so worried about? The calculation was you had to have 3 pounds of the bottom leaves, which people don't eat anyway, to get anywhere near a toxic dose, and you have to do that every day. And I said, if they're worried about liver toxicity, let's go to the Reshish brewery and talk about liver toxicity. Anyway, I went on and on like that for a few minutes. About 2 days later, I was called into my professor's office, and he had a transcript of what I'd said, and I looked at the author, and it was Rahami Media Monitors. Evidently, the government pays this group called Rahami Media Monitors to monitor for critical dissent. So they listen to the papers, even little shitty side things like this, and he more or less said, he said, they don't like what you're saying, Andrew. And I said, well, you know, and he says, your job might be, I said, it's not much of a job, mate. And we sort of stood them down that way. But it gave me an indication of what was going on. Now, iodine, I feel they're tightening the screws on iodine. Now, Lugol's is not the best form of replacement. There's lots of arguments about what the best form of iodine replacement is. We've got Alex Jones in America pushing this stuff called nascent iodine. I've looked and looked and looked. I don't even know what nascent iodine is. It's something to do with an atomic form that no one can define, and I think he's just trying to get a market advantage. I use potassium iodine. It's extracted directly from seaweed and crystallised, so it's chemically pure and free of all the possible marine contaminants. It's better absorbed than Lugol's, and as I said, I'll be selling little jars of it. And I think if you're clever, you'll get a hold of it. Don't use it as a protection against the radiation coming out of Fukushima in an emergency way. There's 2 ways of using iodine. The emergency way, and the way the Americans are stockpiling it, is that if you have a big thing like Chernobyl, then you rush doses out to all the population. You take something like 30 times, about 100 milligrams in about 100 milligrams in one dose, and it blocks the uptake of iodine. It shuts down your thyroid. So your thyroid, used to having small amounts of this stuff coming in, if you take a massive, massive dose, it shuts down. You get a 10-day thyroid block. And the idea is iodine 131, which can come off the nuclear reaction, is not absorbed into your thyroid because your thyroid shuts down. It's much more sensible over 3 months or so to saturate your thyroid gland with iodine. So if the iodine 131 comes along, there's no place for it. And it equally applies to the non-thyroid binding sites like breast tissue and stuff like that. Your question about topical, yeah, perhaps, but since potassium iodine is available and it's easy and tasteless and no side effects, that's the easiest way to do it, and that's the way I recommend it. My recommended dose is between 4 and 12 milligrams a day, which is very much higher than 0.15 of 1 milligram.
I'm actually answering, you're putting this question on the floor because it's got a big word. Oligodendrogliomas.
Oligodendroglioma,
yeah. How responsive is that to cannabis or THC?
Well, look, there's no large studies. I'm following one boy, Damien, down in Victoria. Do you know Damien? Okay. Damien's had an oligo. He was sent home to get his affairs in order several years ago, and we've been working together and we get him seeds, and he's a bit of a grower. He's trucking on. The brain cancers of their various forms do appear to be rather more sensitive to cannabis than a lot of other tumours. Now, to try and work out why some... See, look, in my very first foray into the Rick Simpson oil was about 2.5 years ago. I might have told some of the crowd this. A lady turned up with metastatic breast cancer, and she had a nerve invasion from the cancer, and the arm was paralysed and she was in serious pain. And at that stage, I hadn't done the Rick Simpson method, boiling it down in hexane and concentrating and things like that. And the family were crying on the doorstep saying they said Mum's going to die, and looking at her it seemed like a pretty accurate estimation. So we did this. We got a $4,000 pound of top 22% white rhino, I think it was at that stage. Boiled it down. I basically had her anaesthetised for 18 to 20 hours a day for 3 weeks while we went through this treatment, and as I expected it to help the neuropathic pain, and it did, right? But then the arm started to recover, and she went on to live another 2 years till she died of a shower of metastases that was then unresponsive. I learned 2 really important things. Some cancers are responsive and some aren't, and even the responsive ones can, if you don't adopt the lifestyle things, develop resistance later on. Okay? I can't give a definitive, but where it's going in the future is when people have cancer biopsies, and this is important, when they have biopsies to establish whether you've got cancer or not, what we want to do is look at the cannabinoid receptors on the tumour initially. Now, they're doing that with prostate cancer, just looking at CB1 receptors, and we're trying to get North Shore Hospital to come on board with this, and when they do their biopsies, send us the ones, or at least give the address to us of the ones with the very high density receptors, so we can predict who's going to respond. But coming back to your oligo question, because they're often not biopsied anyway and they're diagnosed on MRI, remember, it's a much slower growing tumour than a GBM. I mean, your chances of living for years are much higher, and the one that I'm following so far is doing quite well.
Now, if there's recession of the tumour, have you seen any brain defects as a result of it being slow growth and then receding, and there being gaps in the head, so to say? Or
hang on, I didn't get the question.
Sorry, with the precision of the tumours, have there been any ill after effects as a result of the tumour being slow growing and then receding in the brain, and then there being sort of space, so to say, or things jumbled up?
Oh.
As a result of
if I understood the question, you're saying if the tumour shrinks, you're going to get problems from that.
Yeah,
a resounding no. No, it's not going to leave a space. Oh, we get rid of the tumour. Oh, what's the space?
No, I was just wondering if there's any sort of adaptation as a result of the brain that, if it were to recede, that there may be some sort of ill adaptation. As a result.
That's too hypothetical. But the interesting point that's there is adaptation. You've all heard of brain plasticity. When I was at university, the dogma was in big capital letters of the brain can't regenerate. Right? The brain can't regenerate. How many times are they going to say it? The brain can regenerate, especially in children. We're following a little child, Larissa, down in Sydney. She had a massive stroke because of an obstetric disaster at Gosford Hospital, and she completely lost her pituitary, and for the first year and a half of her life was dependent on pituitary hormones. We've had her on CBD dominant oil now for 18 months, and 4 of the pituitary function have regenerated, and we're following that with massive interest. So the brain can regenerate. The plasticity, I've never seen a dysfunctional regeneration, if that's what your question was.
I just know a Dr. Jeffrey Herringardner in California, and he had done some work with children with epilepsy with massive tumors in their head. And when the tumors had receded, they were left with epilepsy for the rest of their lives, whereas prior to the tumor, they never had that.
I'll have to look at that. That sounds, you've got to look at the fine print.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew.
Maddie, is that
It's Adi.
looking well?
Yes.
Can I tell you a story, or?
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. I would like you to speak, because you've said that the medical cannabis is more effective for some particular types of cancer, and for some it's less effective or not effective at all. Can you please address the question of the cumulative effect of also that Rick Simpson stuff talks about dosage, that healing from cancer and other conditions is dose related, and I'm quite controversial about this, of my personal views. And I would like you to address this because he speaks about the 1 gram dosage being effective, and I'm wanting you to address the issue of the cumulative effect of medical cannabis as correcting cancers, all types of cancers and other chronic conditions based on an accumulative effect, not dose related.
Yeah.
And obviously lifestyle.
That's a really important question.
Yeah, and also in relation to that, the medical cannabis and its whole interconnection with the immune system and the central nervous system.
Yeah. Big question, but important. Okay, Addie's a very unique human being in this room because she's experienced the largest cannabis dose that I've known globally. Now, Addie and one other woman suffering with ovarian cancer bravely subjected themselves to an experimental treatment that involved us injecting 12 grams of purified resin into their peritoneum, straight into the tumour. At the time that we'd organised it, because we weren't organising our own growing facilities and we didn't have access to our own CBD, we bought CBD oil from the market from what we thought was an ethical and validated producer. So when I injected the 12 grams, I was of the belief that it was going to be 3 parts of CBD to 2 parts of THC. It turned out to be 8 parts of THC to 1 part CBD when we finally got the analysis. And 12 grams, now remember, when you eat a dose of 1 gram, less than 10% of that's absorbed into your system. Right? So if you get injected 12 grams, that's the equivalent of eating over 120 grams in 1 dose. Unfortunately, because it turned out not to be CBD, there was a fairly pronounced overdose reaction. And I don't think we can underplay how far off the planet Younger Dig actually was. But look at it now, right? Look at it now, looking pretty good, I have to say. It's interesting that the second party, there were 2 diametrically opposed patients. Adi had been diagnosed some years before, apropos to the question we asked before, 15, and had been following a natural health program to control the disease. The other patient had run straight off to chemotherapy and had a couple of doses of chemotherapy. Unfortunately, she's doing very poorly, right? And the cancer wasn't the least bit controlled. And my impression at this stage is the chemotherapy had actually already induced the first stage of resistance and made her virtually untreatable. And that's quite a valuable lesson. In terms of your bigger question of dose, it's taught me one thing. That firstly, that high, see, my concern was, everyone like Rick Simpson saying, oh, you've got to get the gram to get the healing. If that was the case and it was a simple dose effect, we should have cane Katie, right? I mean, there was no shortage of drug on board, right? Even if it was just THC and she experienced a lot of sort of issues, it should have fixed the cancer. It didn't. The cancer progressed very soon after receiving it. So the dose by itself, that taught me a really valuable lesson. And in fact, I've actually reduced the suggestion for the amount of cannabis the patients take down to a titrated level that they're comfortable with. I don't think you actually get a direct, like you do with antibiotics, you get higher doses, you get higher killing. With the cannabis, it's a much more complicated reaction to the tumour and the person. And the way things are best used, the way the cannabis is best used, in my impression now, is in concert with a nourishing diet, including hemp seed, but in doses titrated both in volume of the dose, the size of the dose, and the spacings to best suit the lifestyle of the patient. Right? Say, for instance, you take a gram of Rick Simpson and you sit on your ass all day saying, oh God, my head's spinning. That's not the path to health. You might take 1/100th of that dose and go out and dig in your garden or make love or sing a song or something like that. That's going to enhance your health a lot more. So I look much more as the icing on the cake rather than the main cake. And I don't really push aggressive high doses unless the patient's comfortable and wanting to do that. Right, so I sort of changed the way I approach it in many ways, but it's still an open question.
So basically, can you just confirm that if the medical cannabis, even when taken in smaller, manageable doses, because you need to manage your life as well, you know, when you use it as a whole plant constituent, if it's an accumulated in our system and how the endocannabinoid system interacts and that supports the, you know, the resilience of the endocannabinoid system.
Yeah, well listen, you've actually got support.
Central nervous system.
Yeah, you've actually got support from the American government. The National Institute of Health commissioned Professor Donald Tashkin to prove, this is about 4 or 5 years ago, to prove that cannabis smoking caused cancer. So he set out, he was actually an honest researcher, which is an unusual thing in the American upper echelons of science. But he did an actual study, and at the end of the 3-year study, his conclusion was not only did cannabis smoking not cause aerodigestive cancer, but the incidence of cancer generally in recreational cannabis users was 30% lower than everyone else. It certainly has a protective effect. That has been measured in animal models. In fact, there's rats, I think, or mice, that get adenomas of the liver. If they're pre-treated with small doses of cannabinoids through their life, you can either obliterate that tendency to develop cancers or greatly reduce it. And that model has been used time and time again. Small doses of cannabis are protective. Whether they're protective from a neuroimmunological point of view or from a direct chemical effect or balancing the endocannabinoid system or all of the above is for the future to work out. But yes, low doses are definitely protective. And I must admit, I don't push aggressively the really high doses like we did in the first year or two. It's much more nuanced and subtle thing, and just because someone's making noise on the internet. Unfortunately, about 90% of Rick Simpson's stuff is bullshit, I'm afraid to say. When you chase down a lot of his patients, he's just another loudmouth American that, you know, has got one or two successes, which has grown like fishing stories into many, many successes.
Oh, Doctor, I'd just like to ask, I've had chemotherapy and radiation for lymphoma.
Okay.
I just wonder whether medical cannabis would help me just to take as a preventative in case it's recurrence or not.
Listen, that's a big question. That would take an hour. When we see new patients like that, there's a lot of issues that you explore in a lifetime and things like that. If you want to maximise the quality and quantity of life, yeah, there's a range of different lifestyle things that you have to get. Cannabis can be a part of that, but it's not an essential part. A lot of people have been cured from cancer without cannabis. Don't forget that. The nutritional clinics from the 1900s, the Swiss ones, the Virtue Bennett clinics, the Wigmore clinics, they cured a lot of people with cancer without cannabis. So I don't see it as a mainstay. I mean, the issue with cannabis involved like recreational, preventative and treatment. It's valuable in all of those, but it's not essential. Right? You can get well without it, but I think the judicious and moderate use of cannabis can assist. Yeah. Oh, listen, on that subject, chemotherapy, what we found, because there's a big controversy of whether you should use cannabis whilst you're having chemotherapy, and the fearmongers are saying, oh, don't use the pot, it'll make our chemo less effective. So then they've got an excuse for when the chemo doesn't work. So see, you took pot, now look what's happened to you, you've got cancer. It appears most of the weight of even the serious science are now saying that you can actually enhance your outcomes. Firstly, without having the terrible nausea and vomiting and maintaining the appetite. It's not only that. Chemotherapy causes side effects by oxygen-free radical damage. For instance, the neuropathy people get after some of the chemotherapy is because of oxygen-free radical damage on the nerve. If you quench that with cannabis during the treatment, people can have the chemo without getting the side effects. And no, that's a fact. I mean, reduction of neuropathy is a major thing, because if you get even a risk... Hey?
And lung fibrosis with radiation.
Yeah, because they're all inflammatory mediated. Yeah.
So they're using that now.
So, yeah, if you're down to chemo, if you're on your second or third cycle and you've decided that's what you're going to do, judicious use of cannabis can facilitate that and probably increase the effectiveness of the treatment. I think that's a fair thing to say.
Hi, my father's been fighting leukemia for the past 8 years.
For
Leukemia for the past 8 years. He's been getting chemotherapy and things like that. I was just wondering, how would you work out a dose or something, you know, how would you work out his dose? I've just like talked him around into this, into looking it up and all the facts.
Yeah, the treatment of leukemia is a tricky one because there's many different types of leukemia. Now, if it's 8 years, she's almost certainly got a chronic leukemia. Is that correct?
He was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma first, and then they said that was gone, and now he's leukemia.
Yeah, well that teaches us something, that the cancers are related and they morph from one thing to another, in terms of the blood cancers anyway. Listen, the treatment of leukemia poses an interesting challenge for us, and we're always trying to improve the practice that we do. Now, cannabis by itself, again, it's not a panacea, although it's a lot easier to treat a blood disorder like that because the blood levels are easier to achieve. The problem we're having, say for instance with the ovarian cancer, is, and this is what drove us to actually inject the ladies, the problem is, even if you take heroic doses of cannabis orally, it gets into the bloodstream, but then the cancers have very poor blood supply, so it doesn't get into the cancers. And that's what actually drove us to thinking it was better to actually inject it directly and bathe the tumours. With the leukemia, because the disease is in the marrow and the blood space, it's easier to get access to it. But to tell you the truth, results are sort of mixed, and what we're looking at over the next 6 months is developing a high IVC vitamin C protocol coupled with some cannabis, and we're going to be taking on the next couple of patients in the next month, so I'll have more to talk about next year. Hey?
Can I give you his name then? To maybe go on a trial or do something?
Oh, we're not that organised yet, mate. We're only dealing with handfuls of patients. Right, the big issue is the shortage of quality cannabis. Now, that's the other thing I wanted to talk about. I mean, anyone here, I mean, commercial growers and things like that, we're having a problem with quality control. There's a lot of issues, moral and ethical issues, with people ripping off patients and giving substandard drugs and things like that. And there's nothing worse than having a lethal illness and being ripped off on top of it. But I suppose you people here aren't responsible for that. Yeah.
My son has a diffuse head injury from a traffic accident. He has a lot of seizures.
Speak up.
Sorry, he has a lot of seizures, quite bad epilepsy, a lot of muscle spasm. He's on 2,000 milligrams of sodium valproate a day, plus 1,000 milligrams of Keppra. I tried to make a tincture to see if I could maybe control the seizures as they occurred. Because he can't swallow, I can't give him a large enough quantity. He's peg fed. I can't pour great piles of tincture down through a peg feed.
What wines?
Sorry?
Well, we have peg-fed infants and we treat them by the tube. That's one thing. But
do you use a tincture or an oil for
it depends. A tincture, by that you mean an alcohol tincture?
Yeah.
No, I use an oil infusion generally. But I'm not against using a concentrated alcohol tincture. You can still use a mouth spray if you make it the right way, and topical application is another possibility. We're certainly researching that as a rescue, just going through the skin. Right, but yeah, I mean, there's no reason why make a tincture? Why not make an oil infusion? Why not give it to a whole herb in a food down the peg? There's lots of options there. And also, too, the issue of epilepsy is complicated. What I found, okay, just talking fact, about 2 years ago, when we first got our hands on CBD cannabis, I was approached by 12 different patients who'd been previously well controlled on Tony Mulloway's tincture. So these are kids that had intractable epilepsy, children, all of them, and they'd initially got a good response to the THC tincture that Tony prepared. But over a period of months or variable time, that effect was lost and the seizures returned. When I initiated CBDA treatment on them, the vast majority came under excellent control. Now, since that, in the last 2 years, I've been experimenting with the mixture of CBD and THC in the different forms of epilepsy. This is what I've learned. The majority of children with intractable epilepsy across different types of things, Dravet's and all the known ones, can be stirred up by too much THC, right? There seems to be a fairly delicate balance of the ratios of things that are either good or bad. And if you give too much THC, you can actually provoke seizures in a child that was well controlled. Now, having said that, there's a subgroup that does very well on THC and stays there. And my impression now is our current definitions of what epilepsy is has to be reviewed, because we've given them all these people's names by what the syndrome looks like, and it doesn't apply to your son because that's an acquired one. But all these different names. But in fact, over the next decade or so, we're going to reclassify epilepsy by its response to the cannabinoid. So the THC responsive one is going to be in a different mechanism of action than the CBD responsive. It'll go on like that. For your son, it really depends on the degree of spasticity involved. Usually, if there's some spasticity, we dispense both CBD and THC medicines, so they can be given in different times and in different ratios to control what's essentially two different issues that result from the brain injury. But the way forward is to have access to those, and to that end, as I said, get onto the GoFundMe, let's get a grow room happening. I mean, I've been operating this little research just on 3 lights. We've got 8 going at the moment, but we've got room for 80, and that's the way we're going. We feel now the government is not going to prosecute us, not out of the goodness of their heart at all, but the fact is, if we go to court now, we've already got our legal opinion, there's enough clear legal evidence that we'll win a medical necessity defence and set a precedent that they won't be able to erase from the history books. And that's the reason we can operate more or less with impunity, because we're quite comfortable with being arrested. One of my mothers, Jolene Sierra, was arrested and has been charged with administering a drug to a minor. It's a little more complicated because hubby was growing commercially, but that's neither here nor there. We delight the fact that she will be going to the Supreme Court shortly, and we expect to have our first medical necessity win next year.
Hello. I'm just
this particular is a brain tumour, they have a brain tumour, they're going to go ahead with radiotherapy and chemotherapy. How do we know what levels of cannabis oil to take? You know, the different CBDs and the THC.
Listen, the short answer is there's no guidelines. I mean, we're making up these rules. We're doing that now. No one really knows. And see, look, you can't know things. I mean, I actually believe in experience with GBMs, glioblastomas, right? I actually want the hospital to do a trial. You know, I need the hospital to do a trial. You know, we haven't got the resources to line up 20 patients with standard TMZ, 20 patients with TMZ and cannabis, and 20 patients just don't have the resources, don't have access and stuff like that. We couldn't get it past the ethics committee, right, at North Shore Hospital. So that's interesting. No, the bottom line is I don't know. So what we do when we actually consulting people in a clinical situation, we almost negotiate around their lifestyle and different suggestions and different sort of levels of where it's up to. But I'm increasingly recommending lower doses of cannabis combined with an aggressive dietary approach. Right? I'm not pushing the high Rick Simpson doses now, except in selected cases. But yeah, no one knows. I mean, that's the whole problem. And what's good for one person is not necessarily good for another. The variation in response to cannabinoids is enormous. Like I've given like grams of CBD to children with no ill effect, and you give like 100 milligrams and I goes off my chops. You know, it's an irrational sort of response that people have because everyone starts their head in a different space. So it's really hard to make generalisations. But it has to be an individualised program at this stage. There's no hard and fast rules that we know of, or we give them to you. We're not holding it back.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so maybe you should be having the CBD as well as the THC.
I feel fairly strongly about that. The indications from the tissue culture are combinations work much better than either one. Everyone knows about this entourage effect, although it's more sort of smoke than real. But the synergism between CBD and THC is unequivocal, especially in brain cancer, yes. To that end, I've also brought up, last year we grew clones of what we call our Z7 variety. That's a 15% CBD with a 20:1 ratio of CBD to THC. We grew clones of those and then crossed them with a high THC sativa male, and we've got the hybrid seeds now, what we call the F1. We've analysed some of those and found that most of them have taken on both THC and CBD. So we'll have a few packets of seeds out the back as well, which I'll distribute to people if they're capable of growing, and then you'll have a plant that'll grow THC and CBD in generous quantities and give you the best chance of getting an actual chemical response, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay.
Any more questions besides Michael?
It's a very beautiful presentation, quite in awe about the knowledge that you have, sir. I have a question as far as medicinal marijuana goes. What scientific research is there available that we could research in order to use medicinal marijuana for neurotransmission, for healing apenogene cells?
Hang on.
For people that have...
I'm sorry, start again.
I'm sorry, so I apologise. Is there any known research what effect medicinal marijuana would have on helping to assist the healing of apenogene cells?
Hang on, I'm missing that critical word. The research to indicate...
Yeah, I'm looking for knowledge on what the medicinal marijuana, what effect it would have on people with broken spines in order to help regenerate the apenogene cells and the neurotransmitters.
Yes, okay.
Solution between the epithelial.
So how it operates as a regenerative agent?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Could you shed some light on this, please, for us?
There's not a lot of light to be shed, but there's a lot of promise. Right? There's a case that I explained of Larissa, who's showing unequivocal signs of pituitary regeneration. This isn't subtle, this is big. Right? It's going from not being there to being there, it's massive. So that's a trial of one, but it's very encouraging. CBD cannabis has a very clearly established role in assisting bone regeneration, and there's no reason to think that it wouldn't apply in other tissue as well. So, yeah, for a number of reasons. I mean, if you have a spinal lesion, for instance, say from trauma, there's bound to be a degree of oxygen-free radical damage going on in the wound. The CBD and the THC or L-13 is an anti-inflammatory, an intraneuronal antioxidant, so that can calm the local area and allow the healing to proceed. There's theoretical reasons why it should work.
And does it assist with the rebuilding of neurotransmission pathways, with neural pathways, with the rebuilding of neural pathways? Because the adenosine cells usually go in between 21 to 28 days after a fresh break, and then it's very difficult for people to regain the use of their limbs, etc., etc. And
are you talking about trauma or something?
No, I'm talking about broken spines, when people have broken
trauma.
spines. Yeah. And I'm basically researching a lot of things in order to find ways to help people walk again, and, you know.
Yeah. Okay, not a lot of, I mean, regenerative medicine is critical, but I'll tell you what, the future's looking bright. So after 50 years of naysaying, this can't happen, it's clear that it can. It's only a question of optimising it.
Right.
Yeah, that's the way I said it. I mean, it's not there yet, and they're not spending the sort of time we need on it.
Right.
I mean, regenerative medicine, the purest form of medicine, taking a bad thing and making it good. It's except prevention, which is above that. That's the next best thing.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just while the gentleman's walking over, I did like your discussion and highlighting on the values of good nutrition. And in particular, you were talking about cholesterol, the building block of the human body. And just a quick comment, I just wanted to say that the guy who invented the cholesterol myth is Ansel Keys, as you know, and he was later found to be a bit fraudulent in his raw data. He deleted all the countries that didn't suit him.
Look, I have a disease called ulcerative colitis, and just wondering if cannabis oil can modify that, or...
Yeah, ulcerative colitis is one of the inflammatory bowel diseases and includes Crohn's disease. This is probably one of the most exciting areas because in intractable cases, it can be a real disability. Research done in Israel, I think they took 11 cases of intractable ulcerative colitis. That means the ones that have gone through the mill, steroid unresponsive, the whole disaster, and put them on, I've just forgotten the details, what combinations they used, but half of them went into complete remission and stayed there, and the other half were benefited. So there's clearly a place for it. And given that everything else is fairly onerous, that's one of the areas that I want to work in. I've got a brother who's a gastroenterologist at Concord Hospital, and I approached him about getting us a little trials for him to send me his failures, but the gutless little prick wouldn't, because he didn't want to be involved. So that will have to wait a bit longer. I mean, the problem with asking the doctors to send their failures to you, if you make them well, that puts them into a difficult situation. The patient goes there and says, your brother seemed to have fixed me, but you haven't. But that's where we're up to. Listen, what that's waiting on is a regular supply of CBD. We're working towards that. What I'm doing now too, because of the method at which I use to produce the CBD medicine for the children with epilepsy, it's a very sweet and easy method using a sonicator and an oil infusion. What it does, it leaves about half the resin in the plant material. So what I'm thinking is running the ulcerative colitis trial using the leftovers. So the kids get the cream, as it were, and the leftovers. It's still as good, it's just that you have to grind through it like a cow. But it gives you access to it. And I can talk to you more about that if you want to give me contacts afterwards, because it looks like we're going to have an ongoing supply of CBD medicine as a byproduct of our epilepsy process. And I'd love to do an ulcerative colitis Crohn's disease trial, because the indications are it's going to be as good as in epilepsy. Right? That's the indications. Yeah.
Thanks, Doctor, for a most informative and humane presentation. I've been involved with melanomas for 11 years. I had one and had it cut out and skin graft, the whole 9 yards. Then I got 2 more a couple of months later. I cut those out, and I got 8 more. And when I went...
Were they all on the skin?
They're all on the skin. And the woman surgeon simply, this is at the Royal Prince Alfred Melanoma Clinic in Sydney, she simply anaesthetised the area of the 8 and sliced them with a scalpel squeeze them and wipe them with a cloth. And I said, if that's the best you've got to offer, I'm going to have a look around.
Hang on. At the melanoma unit?
That's right. This is 11 years ago.
Yeah.
And they seem more concerned with the new building they've got, a $9 million building they've got up there. But anyway, this is Professor Thompson. I got into black salve. I started to use that with great success. And when I took a photo of a woman who had breast cancer and was told she had 2 weeks before they would do the operation, and she was told she'd better have both breasts off because she can't be too careful with melanomas. Anyway, she decided to try the black salve, and she put the black salve on.
Hang on, what's breast cancer got to do with melanoma?
Well, I'm just saying, I went back to Professor Thompson, who was the preeminent, the character, and I showed him the photo of this woman who'd used black salve and got rid of it. I said,
listen, okay, look, I'll cut you off there. I don't want to talk too much about black salve. I've had mostly negative experiences. I'm not a fan of it at all. Listen for a minute. Black salve is Black salve is a vesicant. Right? You say you had success. Anyone can burn off a melanoma. You can burn off a melanoma with a cigarette butt, or you can burn it off with pool acid. Doesn't mean you've cured it. Right? I mean, what are you telling me, that you should put black salve on all your tumours? No, I'd say definitely not. Right? I'm comfortable. I don't know what you're talking about with wiping that slide. Normally Thompson's a pretty serious operator, and I've sort of liaised with him in the past. The depth of the melanoma invasion is critical to their survivability, and even though we actively encourage people to treat their basal cell carcinomas with cannabis oil and get great results, with melanoma I recommend that they have conventional surgical excision and then a lifestyle program. Right? Burning something off the surface with black salve doesn't cure it. I've seen some people put black salve on and then needle the bloody tumour. I mean, my horror of that is what's going to happen in 12 or 18 months, right? They don't follow these things up. I've seen idiots inject women with breast cancer with black salve and cause massive ulcerating sores and things like that, so I'm not going to waste our time talking about black salve. It's not something that I use and not something I'm actually open to discussing too much.
I'm now on cannabinoids because I reached the point where they were no longer working. I lost a leg in the interim, so I've learnt the hard way, maintaining a commitment to that.
Yeah.
But now on the cannabinoids, I want to know the best way of taking them. I'm taking it orally, and it's the without the THC, but I also have the THC, and I've just heard you say that a combined of the two, the cannabinoids with the THC, is the better way to go.
It is. I mean, just on that subject, even for recreational pot, putting a little bit of CBD in the weed actually makes it better. Right? It's quite an interesting experience. But look, recurrent multiple cancers means your body is in a state of gross inflammation. Now, most melanomas, a risk factor appears to be an immune paresis in your skin you get from periodic sunburning at a younger age, and that sort of sets the tone for it. But just cannabis by itself, it has to be combined with the lifestyle thing as well. Okay, but treating melanomas locally, in my impression, is dangerous, right? Because it's stirring them up. It's very clear. You can go, like, this is accurate published stuff on melanoma. Depending on the initial depth of invasion, you can accurately predict its propensity to metastasize. Right? A 1 millimeter's got a very low one, a 3 millimeter's very high. That's why the excision is important at the beginning. Right? Having said that, melanoma is one of the tumours that have demonstrated spontaneous remission in the past. So I've seen one case when I was a student at Prince Alfred with Ramsay Stewart, the surgeon, who actually operated on a site where someone had done natural therapies before it was fashionable, and he said that the melanoma biopsy before was gone. So melanomas can have spontaneous remissions, but they're not very common. Melanomas are also subject to a very intensive immunological attack pathway now, again at Prince Alfred. They're doing some good work where they're trying to encourage an immunity to the tumour. So yeah, it's on the way. But to help yourself now in the current thing, a bit of pot, CBD and THC combined, plus a lot of hemp seed in your diet, right? And we push a lot of hemp seed as a smoothie. A green smoothie is our sort of signature way of getting all you want. Combine fruits and berries, hemp seeds, green leaves, and a few other bits, not too much else, together. And you can start to rebuild your body and your immune system to to actually throw off these tumours so you're not constantly generating them. Okay, but all the answers aren't in yet, mate, as to what's ideal.
Would it benefit us next time we go to our doctor to ask them about cannabis for the case of the cause?
Listen, I mean, when people's relationship with their doctor is their own matter. Like, I mean, I've got patients that say something like, oh, should I tell my doctor I'm going to take cannabis? I said, should you tell your mother you're having sex or something like that? You know, it's up to you, right? The doctors have encouraged a sort of a maternal-paternal sort of attitude towards them. You look up to them and they tell you what to do. They're medical advisors, just like I'm a medical advisor. I give you my opinion of what you could do. They give you their opinion of what you should do, and you sort it out yourself, right? The doctors are varied. The majority of them are ignorant half-wits that dismiss things without knowing best. What I said with that cancer diagnosis, oh, you've got 3 months if you don't have treatment. How would you know? You haven't done that control enough. They talk well beyond their knowledge base, right? They operate in an unethical environment. They critically accept the drugs that are given to them by the reps without actually thinking of what they do. They're rapidly making themselves irrelevant in about 90% of what they do, as far as I can see. And they've now become almost an adverse force in health attainment rather than facilitating that. Yeah.
Did you talk about hemp seed?
Which one?
Did you talk much about hemp seed?
About?
Hemp seed.
Oh, hemp seed, yeah, I could talk about till the sun goes down, Michael. But hemp seed are good, right? I mean, politically, as you probably know, we're the only country on earth that doesn't have legal hemp seed. It's not really holding things up because no one's been prosecuted, because it's likely now the Turnbull government is talking about altering the regulations in 2017. I don't know why it's always the year after next. Next year always seems a lot closer, but once you make it the year after next, that's sort of another barrier. Listen, it's going to happen. The reason why it should happen, the right should have happened 20 or 30 years ago. Hemp seed, when you're dealing with sort of dietary therapeutic practice, it really does allow you to direct a patient to a food source where you can guarantee not only the right blend of omega-3 and 6, but the essential B group and mineral cofactors to use it. Right? It's really hard to put a nutritious diet together through all the gimmicks and the supplements and all the special things. With hemp seed, when you combine it judiciously with green leaves, fruits and berries, and ginger and things like that, you can have a really potent therapy in a palatable form, and something that will help from premature infants through to demented adults, right? What more can be said about it? You know, we should be all on it, that's for sure. We expect to have, and unlike the nearest competition around here, we expect to have Australian grown and processed hemp seed by early next year, or going well. That's certainly moving forward now. What else can I say, Michael?
No, mate, just that.
Hey?
Just that.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
No, we're going to have a break and